The woods had always carried a strange kind of silence, the kind that was never completely quiet. During the daytime, it was filled with the sounds of birds, the slow creak of trees shifting in the wind, and the faint trickle of a stream that cut through the forest floor. At night, though, it was different. The quiet felt heavier, broken only by the rustle of something unseen moving just beyond the trees. People in town used to talk about how the forest could change a person. It wasn't just the isolation, it was the way time seemed to stretch out inside it. Hours felt longer. Shadows seemed to hold shape even when nothing was there. On the edge of these woods sat a small community, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. It was the sort of town that felt stuck in time, where old houses leaned into one another and people nodded when they passed on the street. Families had lived there for generations, and their stories were tied tightly to the land. Most of those stories were simple, about hard winters, failed crops, or children who grew up too fast. But some stories carried a darker edge, whispered only when the sun went down. They were about the forest, about people who wandered in and never came back, or the ones who came back changed. Before the crime, life seemed almost ordinary for those involved. The victim, though nobody yet knew they'd become one, moved through their days in the same rhythm everyone else did. Work, home, the routine of small-town life. They were seen as dependable, quiet, even the type of person who blended into the background. But there were cracks, if anyone looked close enough. A strained smile, a silence that lingered too long in conversation. Little signs that something deeper pressed on them, though it was easier for others to pretend not to notice. The other side of the story, the one who would soon be at the center of the crime, lived differently. There was a restlessness in them, a hunger that the town never seemed to satisfy. They moved through people with a kind of charm that unsettled more than it comforted. Some described them as magnetic, others as manipulative, but either way, they had a way of bending situations to their will. People rarely saw their darker side, but when they did, it was impossible to forget. The sharpness in their voice, the quick temper behind the smile, the quiet satisfaction they seemed to take when someone else faltered on the surface. The two were just acquaintances, maybe even friends by the town's loose definition. But underneath, the relationship carried weight. One leaned on the other more than they should, and the balance of power was never equal. There was dependence, but also control. What looked like closeness was more of a grip, a subtle tightening that made it hard for one to pull away. To outsiders, it seemed harmless. To those involved, it was more like a quiet trap. The forest had a way of pulling people together and tearing them apart. It was the kind of place where secrets could be kept, where arguments could flare without anyone hearing. People often went there to think, to escape, to be alone. But it was also where darker thoughts found space to grow. A long walk under those heavy trees could clear a mind or fill it with something dangerous. For the ones in this story, the woods weren't just a backdrop. They were a character all on their own, waiting, watching, almost daring people to step too far inside. The night it all began was unremarkable in every way. The air was cool, the sky was clear, and the town had already gone quiet. The victim had gone about their day, as usual, with no sign that anything was off. They had spoken to neighbors, done their chores, and de-carried themselves with the same tired ease. The perpetrator, too, seemed as they always did, confident, sure of themselves, carrying that same restless energy. If anyone crossed paths with them that day, they wouldn't have guessed what was about to unfold. But sometimes the warning signs don't scream. They whisper. A glance held too long. A word said too sharply. A silence that feels heavier than it should. These small moments often pass unnoticed until it's too late to piece them together. That was the case here. The town, the families, the friends. They didn't see it coming. Nobody thought that a walk in the woods would turn into something that would change everything. Still, there was something in the air that night. The kind of tension you only recognize after the fact. A heaviness in the silence. An unease that couldn't quite be explained. Later, when people tried to make sense of it, they would remember small things. The way the wind seemed to push against the trees harder than usual, the way the shadows felt sharper, the way the woods seemed almost alive. They would think back and wonder if the forest had been trying to warn them. The world was fragile in those moments, balanced on a thin edge between normal life and something far darker. Nobody knew yet that the quiet rhythm of the town was about to break, that the woods were about to swallow more than just silence. Nobody saw how close the storm already was. It was only a matter of time before the fragile calm shattered, and the truth of what happened in those trees came to light. It started with the small things, the ones most people wouldn't notice. A late response to a simple question. A shift in tone during what should have been an easy conversation. These moments built slowly, stacking on top of each other until they became impossible to ignore. The victim began to feel it first, a quiet unease around the other person that they couldn't put into words. Something about the way the perpetrator's eyes lingered too long, or how their words, though calm on the surface, carried an edge that cut deeper than intended. It wasn't open hostility at first. It was control hidden beneath the disguise of friendship. The woods became their meeting ground. At first, these walks seemed harmless, a way to escape the noise of daily life. But the forest had its own way of amplifying things. Conversations that might have stayed calm elsewhere seemed sharper among the trees. Arguments echoed longer. Silences carried more weight. The victim often found themselves cornered, not physically, but emotionally. The perpetrator had a talent for twisting words, for turning every small doubt or fear into proof of weakness. What started as companionship turned into dependence, and dependence turned into a leash. Whispers started making their way through town. Some people noticed how the perpetrator always seemed to have control, how the victim was quieter whenever they were around. A neighbor recalled how, during a small gathering, the perpetrator spoke for the victim, answering even the simplest of questions. Others noticed how the victim's smile seemed thinner, forced, and how their once lively conversations grew shorter over time. Nobody said anything outright. After all, it wasn't unusual for strong personalities to dominate quieter ones. But the unease was there. Tension rose with each passing week. The victim carried the weight of financial struggles, the kind that eat. At a person in silence. Bills piled up, opportunities fell through, and pride kept them from asking for help. The perpetrator knew this, and instead of easing the burden, they used it as leverage. Every offer of support came with strings attached. Every gesture of help carried a hidden cost. The victim became trapped, torn between gratitude and resentment, and the perpetrator thrived on that imbalance. Then came the jealousy, sharp and poisonous. The perpetrator couldn't stand the thought of the victim finding comfort anywhere else. When a victim laughed too freely with others, when they seemed too comfortable in someone else's presence, it sparked something ugly. The charm faded in private, replaced by accusations whispered with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Why do you talk to them like that? Do they know you better than I do? The victim tried to brush it off, but those questions lingered, leaving behind guilt that had no reason to exist. One night, the argument between them cut deeper than usual. It started over something small, a missed meeting, a late arrival, but it spiraled quickly. Voices carried through the trees, one desperate and defensive, the other sharp and unrelenting. That night revealed something raw in the perpetrator. They spoke of being owed, of sacrifices they claimed to have made, of how the victim could never walk away without consequence. It wasn't just manipulation anymore. It was ownership, a declaration that the victim was no longer free to choose. The victim walked home that night with trembling hands, realizing just how dangerous the bond had become. The forest seemed to grow darker with each visit. What once felt like a place of escape, now felt like a trap, a space where the perpetrator could press harder without the eyes of the town watching. And yet, the victim kept returning. There was fear, yes, but also a strange pull. A part of them still believed they could reason, still believed they could find the person they once thought they knew. That hope was the sharpest chain of all, holding them in place even as everything inside screamed to run. Meanwhile, secrets from the perpetrator's past began to seep through. People remembered stories, conflicts with old friends, sudden disappearances from jobs, a history of broken trust. Nothing outright criminal, but enough to draw a pattern of volatility. The victim began to see these pieces more clearly. The charm they once fell for wasn't unique. It was a tool used again and again, leaving behind fractured relationships wherever it went. And now, it was their turn to be broken down. The victim's internal struggle grew heavier. On the outside, they kept up the appearance of normal life, but inside they battled a storm of fear, anger, and confusion. Every choice felt wrong. Confronting the perpetrator risked unleashing their rage. Pulling away risked provoking something worse. Staying silent meant drowning slowly in someone else's control. The weight of it showed in small ways. Sleepless nights, nervous glances, a body carrying more tension than it could bear. The perpetrator, on the other hand, seemed to thrive. The more control they gained, the more confident they became. They leaned into their dominance, testing boundaries, pushing further with each encounter. The relationship shifted from subtle manipulation to outright threats veiled as jokes, to warnings disguised as advice. They spoke about how people in town didn't understand, how only the woods saw the truth of their bond. It was their private world now, and in that world, the rules belonged to them alone. One evening, the victim confided in a close friend, breaking down under the weight of it all. They spoke of fear, of feeling trapped, of moments when they thought the forest itself was closing in on them. The friend urged them to step away, to cut ties, but the victim shook their head. "It's not that simple," they said, and it wasn't. Fear can bind stronger than any rope. Hope can be harder than any darkness. The breaking point was coming, though nobody could see exactly how close it was. The tension between them had reached a point where every word was a spark waiting for the right flame. The forest, with its heavy silence and watchful shadows, seemed to sense it. The town, with its quiet streets and whispering corners, seemed to brace for it. The perpetrator, restless and hungry for control, pushed harder. The victim, exhausted and cornered, searched for a way out that no longer seemed to exist. And in that fragile space, where obsession met desperation, the path toward the inevitable was set. The woods would not stay silent much longer. The night of the crime came without warning, though in truth it had been building for weeks. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet soil after a late evening rain. The forest floor was slick, the leaves glistening under a thin slice of moonlight. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual hum of insects seemed muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The victim walked deeper into the trees, their footsteps soft but steady, each one laced with unease. They had agreed to meet once more, thinking, perhaps foolishly, that this time words might settle what had been growing more violent in silence. The perpetrator was already there, waiting in the shadows. Their figure leaned against a tree, posture relaxed in a way that felt wrong, like they'd been rehearsing this moment. When the victim arrived, the tension was immediate. No greeting, no small talk, just the sound of breath clouding in the cool air between them. The victim's hands were trembling, though they tried to hide it by shoving them into their jacket. The perpetrator noticed, of course they noticed, and a small smile flickered across their face, sharp and cold. IT began with words, like it always did. Accusations dressed as questions. Where were you? Who were you with? Why do you think you can just walk away? The victim tried to answer, their voice unsteady, pleading more than explaining. But every word was twisted, thrown back at them. The forest echoed with the sharp rise of voices, each one louder than the last, until the victim's protests turned into silence. They realized there was no winning here. There had never been. The perpetrator stepped closer, closing the space between them with deliberate slowness. Their voice dropped lower, calmer now, which somehow felt more dangerous than the yelling. "You don't get it," they whispered. "You're mine. You always will be." The victim's chest tightened, panic pressing down like a weight. Their mind raced, thinking of escape, of running, but the forest seemed endless, the darkness swallowing every possible path. Their heart pounded so hard it hurt, and every instinct screamed to move, to fight, to do something. Then it happened, the moment when everything snapped. Maybe it was the victim pulling away too sharply. Maybe it was the perpetrator's hand gripping too hard, refusing to let go. Maybe it was both of them, their fear and anger colliding all at once. What began as a struggle of words turned into a struggle of bodies. The victim pushed back, desperate for space, while the perpetrator's grip tightened with a strength fueled by rage and obsession. The sound of snapping branches filled the air as they stumbled, their fight spilling onto the damp forest floor. The victim gasped for breath, their chest heaving, as the perpetrator pressed them down. Every thought became survival. Get free, get out, live. They clawed, kicked, begged, their voice breaking into raw, choked cries. The perpetrator's face twisted with fury, a mask of something unrecognizable, their eyes wild with a need for control. In that frenzy, reason vanished. They weren't thinking of consequences anymore, only of silencing the fight, of crushing the resistance that had dared arise. The woods became a witness to violence it had seen before and would see again. The sharp crack of a struggle echoed into the night, followed by a silence that fell far too quickly. The victim's body went still, the last breath slipping from their lips in the cold air. For a moment, everything froze, the trees, the shadows, even the wind seemed to stop moving. The perpetrator knelt there, staring down at what they had done, chest heaving, hands trembling. Shock set in like ice. The anger drained away, leaving only horror in its place. They whispered the victim's name, as if saying it might undo what had happened. Their hands shook as they touched the stillness of the body, pulling back as though burned. For the first time, they looked small, broken even, their confidence shattered by the weight of what couldn't be taken back, the F. Orest smelled different now. Iron and earth mixing into something metallic and heavy. The sound of an owl in the distance made the silence feel even louder. The perpetrator stood slowly, stumbling backward, their mind racing with thoughts that crashed into each other. Denial, panic, regret. They muttered to themselves, words spilling out without meaning. This wasn't supposed to happen. You made me do this. I didn't mean, but no amount of words could change the sight before them. The victim lay motionless, their face pale under the thin wash of moonlight, eyes open and glassy. The perpetrator turned away, pressing their hands into their hair, pulling at it as if pain could wake them from the nightmare. Their breaths came fast, shallow, like they were drowning on dry land. The panic shifted into desperation. They thought of what to do next, their mind clawing for a plan. Should they run? Should they bury the body deeper in the woods? Should they try to make it look like an accident? Every option felt impossible, yet doing nothing felt worse. They crouched again, hands shaking as they tried to lift the victim, but their body felt heavier than it should, limp and unyielding. The perpetrator dropped them back to the ground, staggering to their feet as tears burned hot in their eyes. Time lost meaning in those moments. Seconds dragged like hours, the night stretching on without mercy. The forest, once their private refuge, now felt like a cage closing in. Every shadow seemed to watch. Every creak of branches sounded like a warning. They couldn't stay, but they couldn't leave. They were trapped, not just by the body on the ground, but by the weight of what they had done. At last, instinct took over. They stumbled deeper into the woods, desperate to hide the evidence, to bury the truth beneath layers of dirt and leaves. Their hands dug into the wet soil, nails breaking, skin tearing, but it wasn't enough. No matter how deep they dug, it couldn't erase the image burned into their mind. The victim's last breath, the look in their eyes as life slipped away. When it was done, or at least hidden enough to fool the morning light, the perpetrator sat back, covered in sweat and mud. Their chest heaved as they stared at the disturbed earth, a shallow grave that screamed louder than any confession. The forest would keep the secret for now, but secrets have a way of rotting through the ground until they surface again. They rose unsteadily, stumbling out of the clearing with clothes stained and minds fractured. Each step away felt both like escape and condemnation. The victim's absence would not go unnoticed. The town would whisper, questions would rise, and suspicion would circle closer and closer. But in that moment, the perpetrator's only thought was survival. Get out, breathe, pretend nothing happened. Yet the forest never forgets. The silence that followed the crime was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the weight of betrayal, fear, and the irreversible mark of violence. And as the perpetrator vanished into the shadows, the woods stood still, holding on to the truth, waiting for the day it would be dragged into the light. The morning after the crime, the town woke to a silence that felt heavier than usual. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Shops opened, children hurried to school, and neighbors exchanged greetings in the cool air. But by noon, the whispers began. The victim hadn't shown up where they were expected. Calls went unanswered. The routine that once defined them was broken. And in a town where every absence was noticed, people started to worry that first. The explanations were simple. Maybe they overslept. Maybe they had gone to visit someone out of town. But as the hours stretched and the sun dipped lower, the worry turned into unease. By evening, that unease became fear. Families gathered in hushed tones. Friends exchanged anxious looks. And the once ordinary day shifted into something darker. For the perpetrator, the hours blurred into a haze. Every knock on the door, every passing siren, every sound in the quiet house felt like a hammer striking against their chest. Their hands still carried faint traces of soil, no matter how hard they scrubbed, and their mind replayed the moment again and again. They tried to convince themselves it hadn't been their fault, that it was anger or fear or some accident beyond their control. But the weight of the truth pressed down harder than any excuse could hold. They avoided people, slipping through the town with their heads low, rehearsing lines in their minds, in case someone asked. I haven't seen them. I don't know. But the fear wasn't just of being caught. It was of being known. Because the mask they had always worn, the charm they used so carefully, now felt fragile. Cracks were showing, and they knew people would soon see through them. The victim's family was the first to speak out. Calls turned into pleas. If anyone has seen them, please let us know. Flyers were printed, faces of hope plastered against every pole and window. Search parties gathered at the edge of the woods, flashlights slicing through the darkness, voices calling out into the trees. Each unanswered shout echoed back with a hollowness that tore through the community. The woods became both a place of hope and dread. Hope that the missing might be found alive, dread that the truth would be worse than imagined. For the community, the disappearance felt like a wound. The victim had been part of the rhythm of the town, woven into daily life in ways people hadn't realized until they were gone. Their absence left spaces everywhere. A chair at the table, a voice missing from conversation, a routine broken in small but painful ways. Neighbors replayed their last interactions, questioning if they had missed signs, if they should have said something when they noticed the strain in their smile. Guilt spread like a shadow, touching everyone in its path. The perpetrator watched from the sidelines, torn between relief that the truth remained hidden and dread that it couldn't stay buried forever. Each night, sleep refused to come. When it did, it came with nightmares, visions of the victim's face, eyes wide, lips moving with words that could no longer be heard. They woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the silence of the house pressing against them like the weight of the forest. The guilt didn't show itself in public. To others, the perpetrator carried themselves as they always had, calm, collected, and even helpful. They joined the searches, walked the same paths they had walked that night, pretended to look under branches and into shadows they already knew too well. Their voice joined the chorus, calling the victim's name, each shout a lie that echoed back like punishment. People commended their effort, never guessing that their hands had written the very ending they were all desperate to avoid. But in private, the cracks grew wider. Food lost its taste. Every reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger. Their body carried tension that no amount of pacing could shake. They began to talk to themselves, muttering fragments of excuses, bargaining with memories. Some nights, They even convinced themselves that it hadn't happened, that maybe the victim had just run away, that maybe the woods had taken them, and not their own hands. But the truth always returned, sharper than before. The victim's family carried their grief openly. Their voices broke during interviews, their eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. They begged for answers, their pain spilling out into the public, forcing everyone to share in their loss. The media arrived, turning the small town into a stage. Cameras captured the desperation, and reporters repeated the story until it became more than just a local tragedy. Strangers who had never known the victim spoke their name, shared their picture, and joined the search. But with the attention came judgment. Some whispered theories, pointing fingers at anyone who seemed too quiet, too nervous, too unwilling to talk. Old grudges resurfaced, and suspicion clung to the town like smoke. The perpetrator felt the eyes on them more than once, though nothing yet pointed directly at them. Still, every glance, every pause in conversation when they walked by, every shift in tone felt like an accusation. For those closest to the victim, life fractured into two halves, before and after. The routines that once gave life structure now only highlighted the absence. Their favorite chair stayed empty. Their voice no longer filled the air. Birthdays, dinners, even casual evenings carried a sharp edge, a reminder of I was gone. The grief was relentless, a constant companion that shadowed every step. The community itself changed. Where once there was ease, now there was fear. Parents kept children closer. People locked doors that had long stayed open. Conversations lingered on what-ifs, on whether the woods were cursed, on whether evil had always been walking among them unnoticed. Trust, once the lifeblood of the town, grew thin, replaced by suspicion and silence. And still, the perpetrator carried the secret alone. Their minds swung between guilt and justification. Some days, they told themselves the victim had pushed them too far, that it had been unavoidable. Other days, the weight of what they had done nearly crushed them, their chest aching with the knowledge that they had taken a life and destroyed countless more in its wake. The duality tore at them, making every moment feel stretched between confession and denial. The longer the body stayed hidden, the more restless they became. The soil where they had buried the victim haunted them in dreams, the earth cracking open, hands reaching out, eyes staring with unblinking accusation. They avoided the woods in daylight, but at night, something drew them back. They found themselves standing near the site, staring at the ground, whispering apologies that vanished into the wind. The crime had begun as a moment of violence, but in its aftermath, it became something larger. It wasn't just the silence of the victim's absence or the grief of those left behind. It was the ripple effect that spread through every life, every relationship, every corner of the community. People questioned themselves, their safety, and their understanding of one another. The town itself felt altered, its foundation shaken by the knowledge that something so dark had unfolded within its borders. The perpetrator remained free, at least for the moment, but freedom came with its own prison. Every glance felt suspicious, every word a test. They live, with the constant fear that the ground would give way, that the truth would crawl out from the soil they had tried so desperately to cover. And beneath it all, deeper than fear or guilt, was the knowledge that nothing could undo what had been done. The victim's absence was permanent, their life stolen not just from themselves, but from everyone who had loved them, from the community that had once felt whole. That absence echoed in every conversation, in every empty seat, in every whispered prayer. And though the world moved on, inch by inch, the shadow of that night in the woods stretched long, reminding everyone that some wounds never close, and some truths never stay buried forever. In the months that followed, the story of what had happened in the woods became impossible to contain. The victim's disappearance had already drawn the attention of neighbors, then the media, and finally law enforcement. What had begun as whispered suspicions turned into open questions, and what had once been hidden beneath the soil of the forest slowly came undone. The body was discovered after a long stretch of searching. The disturbed earth finally giving way to the truth. That discovery shattered the last fragile thread of hope the victim's family had been clinging to, turning grief into something heavier, an ache that could not be soothed. The perpetrator's arrest came soon after. It was not a dramatic chase or a clever confession, but rather a slow tightening of evidence. Inconsistencies in their story, traces that didn't wash away no matter how carefully they tried, and the weight of suspicion that had never fully left them all came together. When the handcuffs finally closed around their wrists, the mask they had worn for so long cracked completely. For the town, the arrest brought both relief and horror. Relief that the person responsible was no longer free, and horror that it had been someone they had known, spoken to, even trusted. The trial that followed drew eyes far beyond the small community. Reporters filled the courthouse, cameras lingered outside, and the details of the crime were laid bare for the world to hear. The victim was remembered in stories shared by family and friends, small acts of kindness, dreams they once carried, the quiet way they touched people's lives. The perpetrator, once seen as charming and persuasive, was exposed for what they were, a person driven by obsession, control, and rage. The courtroom became a place not only of judgment, but of revelation, where the balance of power finally shifted and truth stood where lies once lived. When the sentence was delivered, it did not erase the loss, but it gave the family and community a kind of closure. Justice, in its cold way, had been served. Yet even with the perpetrator locked away, the wound they left behind could not fully heal. The victim's loved ones faced the cruel reality that justice could not bring them back, that the absence at the dinner table, the silence in their home, would remain forever. The perpetrator, stripped of their freedom, was left to live out their days in the shadow of what they had done, the control they once thrived on gone, replaced with walls and steel bars. The broader impact of the crime reached far beyond the individuals involved. For the community, it became a moment of reckoning. Trust, once the foundation of small-town life, was no longer given easily. Parents grew more protective, neighbors more guarded. The woods, once a place of peace or escape, now carried a darker reputation. People avoided its paths, no longer hearing the rustle of leaves as calming, but as threatening. It became a symbol of the violence that had unfolded there, a scar on the land itself. Society at large took something else from the story. The case became part of a larger conversation about control, obsession, and the unseen dangers that exist in relationships. It highlighted the ways power can be abused quietly, how manipulation and dependence can grow until they trap someone in a situation they can't escape. It showed how financial struggles, social pressure, and the silence of others can make people vulnerable, and how often the signs of danger are missed until it's too late. The moral questions it raised were heavy. People debated endlessly. Was the crime the result of a single moment of rage, or was it the inevitable end of a pattern of control? Could have been prevented if someone had spoken out earlier, if the victim had felt safe to reach for help, if the community had been more aware. The answers were never simple, but the discussions lingered. They forced people to look not only at the crime itself, but at the structures around it. The way society overlooks emotional abuse, the ease with which people excuse controlling behavior, the silence that allows manipulation to grow unchecked. In the end, the story became less about the crime itself and more about the ripple effects it left behind. It was about the family who learned to live with a permanent absence, carrying grief that time could dull but never erase. It was about the community that lost its innocence, forced to confront the darkness in its midst. It was about the perpetrator whose hunger for control destroyed not only their victim, but also themselves. And it was about the truths it revealed about human nature, the capacity for obsession, the fragility of trust, and the thin line between love and control. Today, as time passed, the intensity of the media coverage faded, but the memory of the crime did not. For those closest to it, every anniversary brought the pain back to the surface. For the town, the forest never returned to what it once was. And for the larger world, the story became another reminder that evil does not always appear as a stranger in the dark. It can live beside us, smile at us, and walk through the same doors we do. Justice was served in the legal sense, but in the human sense, it remained incomplete. Nothing could balance the scale when a life was taken, when love was shattered, and when fear replaced safety. What the story left behind was not resolution, but deflection, a reminder of the cost of silence, the danger of unchecked control, and the need for vigilance in the places we least expect danger. The forest still stands, quiet as ever. The wind still moves through its branches, the earth still shifts under its roots. To anyone passing through, it may seem like just another stretch of trees. But for those who remember, it is a place forever marked, a reminder that even the most ordinary settings can become the stage for the darkest acts of human nature. And in that truth lies the most haunting lesson of all, the fragility of life, the weight of choices, and the unshakable fact that once innocence is lost, it cannot be regained.